Today, I am going to be talking about Chapter 8 in the book How to Do Life by Tralek Rinpoche. And this chapter is called Witnessing Our Emotions. And I personally like this idea of witnessing. He begins the chapter by actually packing a lot into the opening page on this, and I'm going to do some quoting from that, but he goes over what has been covered in some of the previous chapters, and that our emotions, no matter how they manifest, are our creations. They're not something that just happens to us or something that comes from some source beyond us, that we're not destined to fall in love with this person, or it's written in the stars, or something like that. We create these emotions and we use them. We use emotions like anger, jealousy, guilt. And he uses the word strategic, that we use them to accomplish certain purposes and to create specific outcomes. We do this with positive emotions and we do this with negative emotions. So if we're going to be doing it, we might as well lean into the positive emotions. And the negative ones are negative because the purpose is egocentric, that we're trying to prove our own ego, bolster our ego, accomplish things just for ourselves, and we don't care about others. Maybe we're interested in how other people see us and so forth. Here is a quote. This process may be conscious, partially conscious, or unconscious, dependent on our level of awareness and attentiveness to our reaction, to our level of self-knowledge. We use self-deception in order to solidify our identity or our ego and create pretense. So it is really important to understand our emotions, to recognize our self-deceptions. And the way to do this, of course, is with mindfulness and awareness, that we observe and we can witness. We can experience these emotions as they arise and get to know them much better. We can give them space to arise without being afraid of them, trying to run away from them, trying to change them, bottle them up. We can just let them be and observe them and let them go. It takes a lot of practice to be able to do this, but it is definitely something that is possible, and this is the direction we want to go in. If we look, we might see something, but if we don't look, we're not going to see anything. We're just going to be where we were before we came to Buddhism, perhaps, and we get involved in self-deception, we get involved in strategies, and so forth. When we start looking, when we become mindful and pay attention to these things, these strategies become visible little by little. We might get glimpses. We start realizing that these emotions are made out of parts and pieces, and we can work with the pieces rather than working with the entire emotion, which can seem sometimes like impossible to work with. Quote, to be able to restructure our life, intentions, motivations, and perceptions of the world in order to see through our self-deception, we can use our emotions still as strategic communication tools, but in a much more helpful, fulfilling, and constructive way. That is the direction we want to go in. We want to have an increase, a growth in our awareness, our wisdom. We want to be able to see what works, what doesn't work, why it doesn't work, why it is harmful. He mentions that spite, guilt, resentment, arrogance, and so forth are all totally worthless, and they're actually harmful. We want to be able to distinguish between what is helpful, what is harmful. We want to realize that our habitual patterns are habitual patterns, we are the ones that created these habits and that we can work with them and weaken them and establish new, much more beneficial habitual patterns. So this all depends on witnessing. He uses the phrase emotional experience, witnessing this emotional experience free of elaboration, rationalizations, intellectualization. In other words, just letting it be, observing it, getting to know it, not adding anything, not taking anything away. And it's very difficult to do this, and don't expect to do it right away, or even do it for more than maybe a moment or two. It's not an all or nothing experience. And if you do experience, then seeing it as it is without adding anything, then make sure that you don't start at that point intellectualizing it, because it's so easy. Our ego is always trying to gain ground, and we have to be careful of this. So it is through having a regular meditation practice that allows us to develop this ability to see beyond our excuses, our intellectualizations, our habitual patterns, to start seeing things freshly, to be present, and to have room to accommodate whatever arises. That's very important, to have the space for things to arise and not get claustrophobic. When you can make friends with your emotions, they're no longer a stranger to you, and they no longer have the ability to control you. And this is what freedom is all about. Kralik Rinpoche actually says something to the effect of, how can you be friends with others if you aren't friends with yourself? I found this very interesting because he had a quote, one sentence in this chapter about seeing your emotions clearly takes their strength away. I one time had lunch with Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche at Karmeling, and afterwards we all got a fortune cookie, and my fortune read, to see your drama is to be liberated from it. And that's exactly what's being talked about here, that if we make friends with our drama, he uses the phrase, it's like seeing yourself in a mirror when you're committing a crime. So that our emotions are learned skills with emphasis, and that we can learn new and more beneficial skills, and we can see through our old emotions and realize that they're not as frightening or as strong or as permanent as we would like to see them. Another way to put this is, we realize that we installed these buttons that we think other people push, and we can learn how to uninstall the buttons. He then goes on to talk about how self-condemnation is a form of identity. It's a form of ego and ego clinging. A lot of people think that on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high, that they are about a 1.2. I'd like to remind people that Milarepa killed 35 people, and so far, at least, they haven't killed 35 people, probably haven't even killed one person. Yet they still look at themselves as if they were a mass murderer, because they keep beating themselves up over little things, and perhaps have a long laundry list of all the things they've done wrong their entire life. So we need to listen to that inner critic, get to make friends with him. Quote, we often tolerate tremendous punishment from ourselves to ourselves. This can leave us with little tolerance for others. So he goes on in this area saying, we deny or explain this pattern of ours, and then when we see the same fault in another person, we will condemn them for it. In the meanwhile, deep inside, we know what we're doing, and the habit just gets stronger. Another way to put it is, we look into a mirror, see a dirty face, and try to wash the mirror. So we really have to be very, very careful of this. When we start getting irritated with other people, it's always good to take a break and start looking inside. Do I ever do this? And really examine yourself and think about this for a while, maybe a day or two. And then he talks about the words of the Buddha, who said that the condition of life is suffering, and the suffering comes from craving, which exists within one's mind. Again, we need to be responsible for our suffering and realize that it is in our mind and as a result of our craving. But on the other hand, that's liberating, because to reduce our suffering, we don't have to change the world. We don't have to change the people that are causing us to suffer. It's our response and reaction to what people do that causes us to suffer. So this poverty mentality then goes into and feels that it is self-perpetuating. And this poverty mentality is feeling that we're lacking something. It can come from we feel insecure. Perhaps there is a place that is vulnerable to change, to uncertainty. And of course, since our ego is a totally fabricated creation, our ego is always in danger of change and is always vulnerable. If we can witness these emotions as they arise, this feeling of need, of poverty, and so forth, without getting too involved in them, too fixated in them, we find that we are more at ease, that our minds are more pliable, they're more fluid. He talks about how life is, from one perspective, just a series of upheavals and difficulties. And this is the nature of life. And we can accept this and realize that we are not the only one that has these difficulties, that it is as normal as the sun coming up in the east. And accept this and work with it, and realize that other people are experiencing the same sorts of thing, and understand that stability is important, but stability is different from rigidity and predictability. Stability means that your mind can remain stable even in the midst of all kinds of upheavals and turmoil, that things can arise unexpectedly, but you don't, you might say, lose it, go ballistic, freak out, that you can remain somewhat calm when other people are not able to do that. This is important. And also it's important to understand that we have unrealistic expectations, and to start understanding what they are. If we can witness, we can see these things. If we can stay with what's going on in our mind, we can see how he uses the word cocooning. And I take that to mean that we build a shell or a wall or a cocoon around ourselves and project a false identity, our ego, surround ourselves with shoulds on our relationships with other people and the world. And meanwhile, we miss what's happening because we're focused on what's going on in our mind, what we want to happen, what we think will happen, what we're afraid of happening, and so forth. In fact, a lot of times we don't even react to what's happening. We react to what we think could happen if what we think is happening gets out of control, and 3 or 4 lines down the road, our world has come to an end. For instance, you're doing your income taxes and you think, the IRS doesn't like this. I'm going to be called in and audited, and then they'll do this and it's going to be miserable. And then after they do that, they'll send me with a bill, and I'll pay that and then I'll be broke, and then I'm broke and my car will break down and I won't be able to afford it. I won't be able to get to work and my whole world will fall apart and I might as well jump off a bridge. And we do that sort of thing. And we react to this long, convoluted chain of thoughts that we have rather than staying present and working with what is actually happening. So he recommends to open up to the relationship, to realize impermanence, that relationships may not last as long as you expect them to or would like them to. On the other hand, when you do this, open up to what's happening and be mindful of what's happening, life becomes more enriching. It becomes more worthwhile. Relationships become more worthwhile and enriching. And I'm reminded of when I have done programs and we've eaten in silence. And then after the eating mindfully in silence, I'd like to have a discussion. And somebody always says the food tastes better, or they didn't need as much to make them satisfied and full. And I reply that with mindfulness applied in our life, life tastes better. It isn't that your life gets better, but you experience the same thing more fully and completely, and you find that it's a better life than you thought you had. Which kind of reminds me of a cartoon that I saw, just a one-panel cartoon. And it was about a man that was up at the pearly gates, and St. Peter was there, and St. Peter told the man, you actually had a pretty good life, but you missed it because you were always watching your cell phone. So relationships are part of our Dharma practice. They are actually a perfect opportunity to see ego and see how our ego works. A wonderful opportunity to open up, to develop more concern for others, to get to know others better, and to develop less concern for ourselves. We can get to know how relationships work, how they begin, how they end, how they evolve, and so forth. We can see what weakens them, what strengthens them, what will develop them, and what nurtures relationships. All of this becomes more obvious as we are able to do more observing and mindful witnessing. We start seeing selfishness more clearly for what it is. So relationships are part of our Dharma practice. It's not that we have Dharma practice and then we have relationships. They are not two separate things. They're just different ways of expressing our Dharma practice. In fact, it's a perfect opportunity for us to see our ego and its workings, to make friends with our ego, get to know it, open up, develop more concern for others and less for ourselves, and just seeing how relationships evolve, that they don't stay in the same place. See what is good for relationships, what has a negative effect on relationships. All kinds of things can be learned from observing relationships with other people. And of course, the idea is to learn how to have better relationships, more meaningful relationships with yourself and with other people. Selfishness is creating a self-image based on interpretations, expectations, insecurity, and projections. This creates a huge amount of problems for us. He finishes the chapter by saying, quote, overcoming a strong self-orientation and selfishness creates a more stable basis for any relationship. Then leads to the next chapter, chapter 9, and this is titled Intention, Expression, and Fluidity in Relationships. And like the last chapter, there's a lot in this short chapter. He begins by saying that we believe that our ego is who we are, that we have this strong sense of a fixed identity. There's something there that fixed means doesn't change, or is extremely difficult to change, or shouldn't change. On the other hand, it has to be constantly maintained because it's very insecure. It understands impermanence at one level, and so it has to constantly be recreated. Actually, the fear of the boundary of our ego is fear. As soon as you run into fear, anxiety, discomfort, you've come to the edge of what you feel you control and entered the territory that you don't control, or you feel you don't control enough. If we can witness this, we start seeing that we are not solid, that we are constantly changing, having new experiences. The old experiences are gone. And this opens up the possibility of growth and the benefits of growth. With plants, a plant needs room to grow into, and we too need space to grow into. Earlier in the book, he talks about movement in a pond, where the movement is coming from bubbling up from the bottom of the pond, but the water in the pond isn't going anywhere. There's no flow, there's movement. And growth means more like the way a stream water flows downstream. It's always moving, but there's an idea of going somewhere. So then he uses anger as an example. Expressing anger, he feels, is not a problem. What can be a problem is how you express it, how we use it. That anger can be about growth or can be about power. We don't want to sit on it. We don't want to bottle it up. We don't want to use our anger to control. It's best to be able to manage our anger, as well as to distinguish between important and trivial. We frequently respond to trivial things as if they were the most important thing in the world at the present time. So we really need to distinguish between important, trivial, to look into things, to understand what's really going on. And again, this is where insight meditation is really important. And contemplate. And if you do get angry, investigate. Avoid getting stuck in the same soap opera year after year after year. He goes on to say that, well, we cannot be liked by everybody, and trying to be liked by everybody is really wishful thinking. And the same thing for being compassionate. It's very difficult for us to be compassionate to everybody. And frequently we can fall into the problem of thinking that we have to be overly expressive of our compassion for everybody, and not everybody wants to be a recipient of our compassion. Some people might want to have you leave them alone rather than do something that you think will benefit them. So helping others effectively takes wisdom, skillful means, and it takes time. Going back to anger, I was reminded of this, really called more like wrath than anger. But what it means is that the anger arises, is directed at the specific problem, and then is gone. It's almost like a lightning bolt that goes right to the problem, and the problem is taken care of, and then lightning bolt is gone, and you don't hang on to the anger, that energy. You just let go of it. And so I had this experience when I was working in the prison. The room right next to mine was called the multi-purpose room, and the Protestant inmate band would practice there. Their instruments were stored in a closet. And one morning I heard some people arguing out there, and I looked out, and there were two groups of people that were arguing. And I went out there, and I recognized the one group as being the Protestant band. And so I stood between the two groups and asked the Protestant band leader, what's going on here? And he started to explain to me. And a man from the other group behind me started talking. And I just turned to him and said, shut up. And then I told the other man, well, what's happening here? And as soon as he opened his mouth, the man behind me started talking, and I turned around and I said, shut up. And I said, well, tell me now what's going on here. And as soon as he opened his mouth, the man behind me started talking, and I went, shut up. And suddenly the whole room got extremely quiet, because this monk that they thought was just all mild-mannered and would never say anything or get angry like that. And then the man from the Protestant choir said, oh, it's okay, we'll come back. And he left, and I went back to my office because the problem had been solved. I really didn't know why the two were there. In a way, I didn't need to, but the problem was solved because one group left and there was no more argument. So that's an example of how you can use anger in a skillful way. I can't say that I always am able to do that, use anger and frustration in a skillful way, but that's what he's talking about here. He then goes on to talk about the middle way. Do not be too extreme. Do not be too concerned. In other words, don't get too self-involved in things, and don't be too selfish. So take the middle way. When we meditate, we talk about the middle way between too tight and too loose. And so it's a bit like that. So when you're working with others, we're not responsible for the whole world. We're not trying to solve the problems of the whole world. We're trying to work with this particular situation and perhaps this particular sentient being, or maybe a small group of sentient beings. We try to work with what we can, what is manageable, and what our abilities will allow us to do. And of course, every situation is unique in its own way. And so there is no real one answer. It is paying attention. Be aware of feedback. Keep your eyes open to what's going on. A good description of this would be you shoot an arrow at a target, and either you hit the target or you miss. Either way, there's a message. And if we can maintain this awareness of what's happening and how the situation is evolving and responding to what we're doing, we can then evolve and respond to what's going on in the situation. Again, fluidity instead of solidity. So if we're going to be better at this, we need to be better at fluidity, at being open, to being willing to change, to consider others, and to be open to what's going on in the environment, to assess what we are seeing, and then decide on the path to go in. Another way to put this is that we're constantly, the best way is to be aware of what's going on and be open to, maybe I should go in a little different direction, because now I see in front of me, this is a problem, but over here, there's an opening. And when it comes to problem solving, it's easy to think I've got a plan and I'm going to get from here to there and follow the plan. But then you take one step in that direction and something happens and you realize that plan A is not working. I need a plan B, and you take a step over to the left. And then from there, you see an opening and you go in that direction with a step. And then there you're in a new place, and then you maybe go in a different direction. And eventually you get to the result that you were looking for, or something that is close enough. My favorite story about this is my former dog that was half black lab. And I had a sparrow that got caught in an outbuilding on the farm here. That was a chicken coop and it had a low ceiling, about 7 feet. And I went in there and a sparrow was flying around and I couldn't chase him out. And I thought, well, I'll bring the lab in there and he'll help me chase him out. And of course, what he did, being a lab, as soon as he saw this bird flying around, he leapt up into the air like a cat and grabbed the bird in full flight in his mouth. And I thought, well, that wasn't exactly what my plan was. And so I called him out. He lay down on the ground. I shut the door. And in a few minutes, he opened his mouth and the bird flew away. So the plan worked, just not quite the way I expected it. It worked actually quicker than I expected. I thought we were going to spend quite a bit of time to chase the bird out. But, that's the way my plans frequently work out. I think that's pretty normal for this world. And he says that since every moment is new, that being overly sensitive, being moralistic, being intolerable just causes more mistakes, misunderstandings, that we need to be aware of the subtleties, the nuances, the possibilities, and be aware that we don't want to offend other people. And we want to be aware of what causes disharmony and avoid that. It actually requires a very stable mind. I talked about that in the other section. We need to have this stable, calm mind that can see more clearly. So then he goes into, well, how do you handle a disturbance between people? He says, well, of course, a common fallback is, well, let's have a discussion and discuss this problem. And that doesn't always work. I overheard this conversation one time between two co-workers, and the one told the other one she was having an argument, a disagreement with another co-worker who wasn't present. And she said, and I told him, I don't understand why you don't understand me. And that's the kind of discussions we frequently have. Needless to say, they don't get very far. They might actually be more like pouring gasoline on a fire. So he says, quote, is my motivation self-cherishing or not, end quote. Other people can quickly detect this, and you can probably quickly detect it in another person. So we have to look at ourselves here. This isn't about changing the world, it's about changing our approach. And are we ignoring the needs of the other person? Are we ignoring what they're trying to communicate to us? What are we trying to achieve? Do we feel that we're entitled to change other people's behavior? In other words, really look inward, get to know yourself better, get to know where you're coming from. And the more you know about yourself, the easier it will be to apply skillful means and wisdom to relationships. Here he goes into more about how anger can be used, except here he uses more about assertiveness. Quote, there is an enormous difference between being aggressive and being assertive and being able to speak up when it is needed. So being a Buddhist doesn't mean that you're a doormat, that you let other people just do whatever they want. It does mean that you actually, by being assertive, you can keep people from creating negative karma for themselves and causing huge problems or even little problems. I told the story earlier about band practice. I can't say that that's the correct approach always when there's a disturbance, but there's nothing wrong with being assertive when it's done with a minimum of ego and a selfishness. Sometimes lamas have to be assertive, and sometimes practitioners have to be assertive, and it works out better for all sides. I have seen Khenpo Karta Rinpoche be assertive. So I'll tell a story about him. This was in either the 3-year retreat or the pre-retreat retreat, where we learned how to chant in Tibetan, how to play the musical instruments, and so forth. This is probably in the pre-retreat. So one of the men, he was quite musically gifted. And we have these, they're called radung. They're these long horns that telescope, and they sound kind of like this. And they're used in some of the services. Well, he was in the shrine room and he was playing Mary Had a Little Lamb on it. Rinpoche came into the shrine room, looked right at him and said, "No!" Turned around and walked out. He never did that again. That's being assertive. With our long-term or short-term relationships, whether it be romantic or otherwise, they need to be open. We need to be aware of the relationship. Probably Rinpoche doesn't say this, but I like the phrase that it's easy to put them on cruise control, like when you're driving. Well, at that point, the relationship is no longer alive. It's just going, and it's not going anywhere. We need to be aware that we are the ones that make the choices, take responsibility for the choices, and then no problem that can't be worked with. No problem could be more like, and they lived happily ever after, like at the end of the fairy tales. It means that problems can be worked with. A mutually agreeable point can come to. I attended a program that the Dalai Lama presented. I'm not sure why he said this. He's never been married, but he said that if you're in a relationship and you get your way 50% of the time, you're doing very well. So part of these relationships is just realizing that there's a lot of compromise and fluidity and flexibility. And the commitment comes on a moment-to-moment basis rather than a year-to-year, month-to-month, week-to-week, or whatever. It's always alive in the moment, and that's where things happen. So remain fully present, be aware because of impermanence that things are constantly changing, that relationships begin, relationships end. They can end many ways. They can end at death, or they can end for other reasons. Even long-term relationships do end at some point. I like this point here. He says it's important to relax. Quote, excessive anxiety creates complexity in and of itself. So do the best that you can to relax in the relationship, have a stable mind, practice, and get to know yourself. The more you care about yourself in terms of nurturing yourself, loving yourself, giving yourself the care that is necessary to be healthy, to have this mental stability and so forth, and realize that the poverty mentality is just your ego and that there's no point in going there, the more you're able to pass these same feelings on to other people. If you don't love yourself, really, you can't love other people. If you don't know how to care for yourself, you can't care for other people. So it might seem contrary to the Dharma, which stresses compassion for others, but it starts with ourselves, learning how to be this way with ourselves. So this is really the core of a relationship, is developing a healthy relationship with ourselves, with our own emotions, and then applying what we have learned to other people. He also mentions that it can be problematic if we think that we should be able to have a good relationship with everybody, or everybody should like us, respect us, and so on and so forth, that because of various reasons, we can't please everybody. We can't have everybody in a good relationship, and don't get too concerned about that. Everybody liking you is a fairy tale. We do what we can, acknowledge our limitations, don't get too Well, avoid self-condemnation. I think that's a good way to put it. Again, keep this idea of change and fluidity, because over time, enemies can become friends and friends can become enemies. It's a two-way street. And after the enemies become friends, they might become enemies later on down the road. I know a number of people that have married, divorced, and remarried. So impermanence is always there. Then he talks about something that kind of put a smile on my face, and that is about making lists of all the things that somebody has done you've not liked. This is so very easy to do. You did so and so at such and such, and you've got this whole laundry list of things that they have done, and then an argument comes up, and you give your list, and they give their list, and it's like, okay, who's going to win this? And you're off to the races. So we need to see that. And when we see it, then drop it. It's like, okay, what are you aspiring to? What's the point of this? What's going on right now rather than what went on 10 years ago? I remember very clearly being at a teaching that Khandro Rinpoche gave, and right out of the blue, she stopped and she said, you Westerners can hold on to things for 10, 20, 30 years. And that must seem very bizarre to a Tibetan, and especially a Tibetan that has a high level of realization. This is just more ego. It's more solidifying things. The past doesn't exist. You're bringing up your memory of the past, and your memory is not all that good, I promise you. Let's work with what's happening right now. That's where change happens. Then he goes on to talk about love, that it's something that is constructed. On the other hand, it's very useful. It's a very useful emotion. We use it to interpret others. We use it to express warmth. And it's good to understand, what are you trying to achieve in a relationship with a person when you say, I love you? Or in all our relationships, what are you trying to achieve by being friends? What are you trying to achieve with your colleagues at work, and so forth? We want to have realistic expectations, realistic conversations, realistic ideas of where we want to go in vision. That's the word I was looking for. That it's our responsibility, that love is a powerful force, and that we need to respond in a responsible way. It is great to be realistic, but realistic sometimes can mean seeing all the faults and flaws of the other person. And that's not being realistic. It's actually being very biased. It's also good to use these relationships and the experience and the feedback from them to learn new skills, to nurture your own wisdom and your skillful means. Here is a quote. Over time, we can gradually learn to make our experiences and expectations more fluid and not so static and solidified. He finishes up by saying that these emotional upheavals that we have, these emotional experiences that we have, such as anger, jealousy, and love, it's good to see the fluid aspect of these, that they come and they go, they're not solid, and to see how we can, through our ego expectations and so forth, turn them into something that is solid, and turn the object of our love into a solid object rather than a person that is fluid, has feelings, is constantly changing, and so forth. The last thing that he says is that by doing this, we can start to see clearly how we are creating our own realities, in the plural, not singular reality, but plural realities.